Um, I'm really honored to be here today, in part because this is a wonderful group to be involved with, and in part because I have to tell you, when you write a book, you sort of have an intended audience in mind, and this is exactly the group that was my intended audience. The book was not intended to be sort of an academic tract or a theoretical analysis of what reconciliation means. It was really meant to be a useful guide, a primer, if you will, for those of you who are living in divided societies and who are dealing with these issues of reconciliation and working for reconciliation every day. So I just want to thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this and to talk about this. I'll mention a few countries by example, but all of you are the experts in your own country's experiences. So what I'm going to do is sort of give you sort of an overview, talk at sort of 30,000 feet up in the air, talking generally about reconciliation, and then maybe afterwards in the discussion, and then in the small group breakups, we'll have more of an opportunity to speak about specific countries' examples. Senator Daly obviously gave a fabulous presentation, and it's definitely a hard act to follow. He highlighted sort of the new world order that we're in, and this list of civil wars that Stan just read really reinforces that. Senator Daly asked a lot of questions about what do we do given this new reality that we're living in. And what I'm going to try to do is certainly not provide the answers, but just provide a way of try to help us think about ways to think about the answers. I want to start with actually last night when President Lincoln was here. It's kind of a fun thing to say that President Lincoln was here last night. And what he said about liberty could really be said of reconciliation. You might remember what he said was that liberty everybody's for liberty. Nobody can be against it. But it has a lot of different meanings. It means one thing to the sheep and one thing to the wolf. And that's exactly the sort of the starting point that I want to begin with reconciliation. Reconciliation is a word that by now, maybe it wasn't always the case, but certainly by now, in the context of political trauma, it's a very familiar word to us. Nobody, I don't think, had to look it up in the dictionary and say, oh, what does reconciliation mean? But on the other hand, if I asked you each to write down on a piece of paper what reconciliation means, my guess is that you'd each write down different answers. Some people would say it means when people are getting along. Some people would say it means when we can put away the past and move on. Other people would say, no, it means when we face up to the past and deal with it. Other people say it's about peace. Some people say we can't even talk about reconciliation until we have justice. Other people say we'll never have justice. We have to talk about reconciliation. And on and on. So there's a lot of different meanings of reconciliation. And these are not only different concepts about reconciliation, they are, like what Lincoln said about liberty, they're conflicting to a large extent. Is it looking at the past, or is it moving on from the past? Does it require trials or not at all? Does it require forgiveness or not at all? In a conference that's going on right now in Bonn about Afghanistan, delegates are trying to figure out how to talk about reconciliation in Afghanistan without Pakistan there, without the Taliban there. Do we engage with the Taliban? Do we not engage with them in order to get reconciliation? So why is this important? Well, I think the primary thing to understand, which you all know from experience, is that reconciliation at this point in our human history is not a choice, it's an imperative. We just heard a really wonderful presentation about not just about Rwanda, but about the nature sort of wars generally. And what is pretty evident to us all by now is that the classic model of warfare has changed. Wars don't take place just on battlefields anymore. They take place among civilians. They take place within families, within homes, within communities. And those are the places that get destroyed during wars. But if you think that war is complex, peace is much, much more complex than that. And the nature of peace has changed. The nature of what we expect from peace has changed. Used to be that when a war ended, you'd sign a peace accord and you would just sort of go back to the status quo or redraw the boundaries or whatever. But the post-war situation would be pretty much like the pre-war situation. Now we have a much, much higher expectation of what peace entails. We expect it to be, in fact, quite transformative. I just want to sort of quote from the materials for this conference, which say, as societies emerge from oppression, war, or genocide, their most important task is to create a civil society strong and stable enough to support democratic government. More and more conflict-torn countries throughout the world are promoting reconciliation as central to their new social order as they move toward peace and stability. I read that kind of quickly, but if you sort of parse out the pieces of what is, that's a really tall order that we expect of peace. We talk about creating a new social order, moving towards peace and stability, this notion of movement, of transformation. And what we expect to happen when we have peace is nothing short of a new social order. We want stability, we want democracy, we want civil society, and we want peace. Moreover, I think it's important to understand that the boundaries between war and peace have changed. It used to be that you knew when you were in a war situation, you knew when you weren't in a war situation. Now, not so much, right? And so we talk about, Senator Dallaire talked about a reconciliation as preventative war. So we're always in these cycles. And as the list that you just read shows, you mentioned a number of countries several times, right? So it's not like you have your war and then you stop. You have your war and then you're dealing with the aftermath of the war and you're trying as hard as you can to prevent another cycle of warfare. And sometimes that effort's successful, sometimes it's not. But of course we all know that reconciliation is a central component of how to make that effort to prevent future wars successful. So the question that we are faced with is not whether to engage in reconciliation or not. It's really what we mean by reconciliation and how do we get there. Last night after the Lincoln presentation, Admiral McCraven asked the question, what would victory look like? And I think, again, that's sort of an interesting way of asking the question about reconciliation. We all know what it means, but really, what does it look like? What can it do, what can it deliver, and what can't it? So what I'd like to do now is sort of provide you with a map, actually 3 maps, sort of an overview of what reconciliation might look like, or actually reconciliations in the plural might look like. What path is the right path for each nation to go through? And the goal here is not to identify the ultimate correct meaning of reconciliation, to say it's the sheep's view or the wolf's view. But the goal is really to recognize the diversity of things that we do when we engage in reconciliation and try to figure out which are the right things to do for each nation, for each situation, and how to get them done. So again, with apologies that this is sort of a very superficial overview of these very, very difficult issues, and obviously the book goes into a little bit more detail on a lot of these issues. So I'm imagining that we're sort of we're sort of in a forest or something. We're in our own countries and we kind of know the lay of the land right around us, but it's really hard to see the overview, the broader picture. And that's what I'd sort of like to map out for you today. If you're in a forest and you're trying to find your way out, you're trying to get to the point of reconciliation or follow the path of reconciliation, there's a few different things that you want to know. One thing is you want to know the lay of the land, what the terrain looks like. So what I'm going to start with is sort of a topographical map, looking at the altitudes, the different levels at which reconciliation might happen within a society. Another thing you might want to know, and this is going to be the second map that I'm going to talk to you about, is what are the landmarks? What are the things that you're likely to see along the way, and how do they interact with that path? Are these things that you need to rush towards because they're good landmarks? Are they things you need to deviate around, or how do you interact with these? And then last and briefly, what direction do you go? And that's always a good thing to know if you're trying to get out of a forest. And how long is it going to take you? Obviously, all difficult questions. So let me start with the topographical map. At the very top level, I suppose, and you'll forgive the hierarchy, it doesn't imply any sort of level, any ranking of importance, just sort of a way to think about the numbers of people involved, or the way we think about these things. One could start with international reconciliation, and that's obviously a huge issue. We'll talk later. There'll be a program on the Balkans from the Balkan ambassadors, and obviously those are very big issues there. You can think about international reconciliation in terms of the U.S. with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. I'm not really going to talk about those, partly because I think they raise different kinds of issues. They raise largely political and diplomatic issues, and I just, for the sake of time, want to focus on the things that are more sort of to the core of what we think about when we're thinking about reconciliation efforts within a nation. So let's start at the national level. Most governments focus on this. A lot of you are from countries where there is a national unity and reconciliation government, or countries where there's been a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a Ministry of Reconciliation. So these kind of national reconciliation efforts get a lot of attention. But I think it's worth pausing to sort of figure out, what does national reconciliation actually mean? It's a problematic term for me because it's sort of a double abstraction. The concept of nationhood is a bit abstract, and the concept of reconciliation is a bit abstract and amorphous, and when you put them together, I don't think it really helps to clarify it at all. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. One thing I want to suggest to you is that national reconciliation, even though we think of it as sort of at the top level in terms of what's going on in the central administration of a government, is in fact a very personal and mental thing. One way of thinking about national reconciliation is in terms of how people associate or identify with the nation. Professor Wills talked yesterday about sectionalism and regionalism sort of overtaking the idea of nationalism, and that's typical of what happens in these Civil War situations. The local or the parochial identities become much more important than the national identities, and people are even willing to sacrifice the national identity and the concept of nationhood and the nation itself sometimes in order to promote their own more local, parochial, or tribal, religious, ethnic, whatever kind of identity. So in political traumas, you get this sort of imbalance, if you will, and I think that the role of national reconciliation is really to try to redress that balance. Not necessarily to make one more important than the other, but to just recognize the importance of national identity operating within the other identities that people have. So I'm not sure that the idea is to say we're not Hutu, we're not Tutsi, we are Rwandan, but to say we might be Tutsi, we might be Hutu, those might be identities that are important to us, but being Rwandan is also very important, or Shia and Sunni, but being Iraqi is very important, or whatever. So I think that the important thing here, I think, is to recognize that we all do operate with many, many different identities going on at the same time. We're part of very many different cultures, part of a religion, part of an ethnicity, part of a professional group, part of a gender, part of a race, whatever it is. And normally we sort of manage those multiple identities without too much friction. And what national reconciliation is trying to do is insert within that group of identities that we all live with the idea of national identity, and make room for that so that it supplements, not supplants, but supplements the other affiliations that people have. So paradoxically, national reconciliation actually, in a sense, takes place at the individual level, although it takes place on a collective basis. And what's important here is for everybody to feel that he or she has a stake in the society, and that that stake is equal to everyone else's. So again, to quote President Lincoln from last night, one of the things that he said was, you all have equal privileges in the race of life. And that's a really central idea, that you all have these privileges, and those privileges are equal to everybody else's. So people have to feel that that's true. Governments have to work to make sure that it's in fact true. Formally, this may be largely a matter of citizenship, defining the citizenry to include all persons without distinction. Governments can do other things also to sort of promote this feeling of national identity and to back it up. And depending on sort of the nature of the country and what's going on, some of these things may be useful, some of these things may be not quite relevant at this point. One of the things that governments usually need to do is to remove barriers that would prevent people from feeling associated with the nationhood. So they need to make ethnicity or the local parochial identity less important, removing those identities from identity cards, for instance. And to treat every person as one, as an individual with dignity, if you will, and not as a part of a group. Now, obviously, this can get very complicated in contexts where you're also trying to remedy the wrongs of the past, and you're trying to give certain individuals within groups as such certain benefits in an affirmative action context, the way we would call it here, or beneficial discrimination. So these things can get complicated, and I don't want to suggest, by sort of flying at this high, sort of superficial level, I don't want to suggest that any of this is simple, but just to raise some of those issues. Other things that the governments need to do in order to promote this idea of national identity and this idea that every individual has an equal stake in the society is to equalize access to resources. So they need to engage in socioeconomic programs that remove any ethnicity-based disparities. And this can cost a lot of money. It can involve making sure that irrigation is proper so that everybody has access to water, to food, to educational and employment programs, for loans for small businesses, all those kinds of things that may have given rise to strife and resentment in the past need to be looked at and need to be removed so that people can feel that as individuals, each one counts. Electoral structures, which are another whole very complicated area, also need to be looked at carefully. Some electoral structures encourage people to vote sort of across ethnic lines. Other electoral structures encourage people to vote within their parochial groups. And so governments want to make sure that when they're developing these structures, that they're encouraging people to sort of work across their lines and not within them. Public education, both in schools and out of schools, in terms of campaigns promoting art, promoting radio programs, other kinds of things that nations can do to promote the idea of national unity, national reconciliation and identity with the nation. And again, the ultimate point here is really to unify rather than to divide. A lot of these things can be done through legal structures, and some of them can be done outside of legal structures. At the next level down, we can look at community reconciliation. This is actually often overlooked, but I think it's probably the most important level. Not that you want to say one is important, they shouldn't do the others. But community reconciliation really needs a lot of attention, because communities are where life is lived, right? Communities are what supports people. If you have strong, healthy, thriving people, it's probably because they live in strong, healthy, thriving communities that are supporting them. And the converse is also true. People who are struggling, people who are trying to find their way, are often disassociated from any kind of supportive community. For those of you who like the term of Ubuntu, the notion is that is where Ubuntu happens in communities. The feeling that you are through other people happens in those communities. And communities are often the places where we see the most suffering and the most sort of destruction from political trauma. People flee, houses are burned, children are taken away, villages are entirely abandoned, and after the war, people come back and they try to recreate or build anew some kind of community structure. So what are we talking about when we talk about reconciliation at a community level? There's a lot of different things to talk about, and I just want to mention one or two here. Often what we're talking about when you have a community and people are coming into it after political trauma, after a civil war or something, sometimes you're talking about refugees who fled and then who come back, and what do they find when they come back? Often they find the same discrimination that forced them to flee in the first place. Often they find people from the other group, the survivor group, who are living in their houses, taking over their businesses, and that needs to be dealt with. Governments need to find ways to support those people who are coming back. Sometimes this is through changing property laws, something as mundane as that, to make sure that people have access to the goods that are rightfully theirs, and to make sure that you can sort of redistribute the assets that people had that were were taken from them. And other times it will involve other kinds of mechanisms to support the ability of people to come back into the communities where they once lived. The other very difficult aspect of community reconciliation has to do with returning soldiers, former soldiers, particularly children, but not only children. Often these community reconciliation programs are done in conjunction with demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration programs. My sense is that a lot of those programs don't get the attention that they deserve. They're actually incredibly important to help people come back into the community as a constructive rather than a destructive force. So those are places that even when they're in place, we still have to look at them to make sure that they're actually effective and doing what they need to be doing. There's a number of different ways of thinking about supporting people who are coming back into communities, and I'll just mention sort of a couple of different dimensions of ways that we might think about this. One dimension is sort of symbolic. For a lot of human nature in a lot of different contexts, we use rituals to help us move from one status to another. We do that with death, we do that with marriages, we do that with all kinds of things, where there are rituals that say, that was then, now we're going through this ritual, and then the future is going to be different. And to help deal with difficult issues or even celebrate happy issues. And I think symbolic or ritualistic ceremonial processes probably have a very important role to play in community reconciliation and ensuring that people who are coming back are actually welcomed back into a community. Another dimension that we want to look at, particularly this is true with returning soldiers, returning perpetrators, people who have done wrong, but if they have no place else to go after the war, they're often coming back. And again, often very true with children, the more children are impressed into service. One of the things that a lot of communities do here is develop some form of an undertaking that the returning soldier can do to show his or her bona fides, to show that he or she is sort of leaving that life behind. Yes, they did these terrible things, but now they're coming into the village and they want to be accepted, and again, they want to be a constructive force in the village rather than a destructive force. And so they have to do something to sort of try to prove their commitment to the rebuilding and regeneration of the community. A lot of times, the most successful of these kinds of efforts reflect traditional, local, indigenous community values. And in my opinion, the range of things that a person can do to show that commitment is almost infinite. And I've read of instances where people pay a fine. That's a fairly straightforward one. But other ones might be even sort of more constructive. I've read of instances where somebody comes in and they say, well, yes, you can return, but you did all these terrible things and we want to know that you're really a different person now. And you need to clean out the churchyard for a year every week. Or you need to work in the fields, or you need to help rebuild these houses. And obviously these serve two purposes, right? One is labor, and that's a good thing in these situations. But the other is a way for the individual to say, I'm no longer that person, I'm really this person, and this is who you have to accept, the person who's working in the fields or building the house. Or this is who I'd like you to accept, the person who's doing that. And often that can sort of help the reintegration of the individuals within the communities. Communities, I think, one is always nervous about generalizations, but I think it's probably fair to say that all communities have some form of dispute resolution mechanism. And when you're engaging in these processes, it's really useful to look at those mechanisms that have worked in this community for these people for generations and say, how can we use them or how can we adapt them to the new situation? The Gacaca courts in Rwanda are sort of one example of that, of using something that was already familiar to people and then saying, let's sort of modify and adapt it to this new situation to help people reintegrate. In East Timor, there is a process of acogimento, sort of a reception, a process of bringing people back into the community. Even in the United States, not terribly known for reconciliation efforts necessarily, but in Greensboro, North Carolina, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was designed specifically to deal with some incidents of racial violence that had taken place in that community. And the city came together and said, we want to deal with this, we don't just want to let it be, and we want to develop this process to rebuild our community. Again, the ultimate goal here is just to enable people to live together in peace so that communities can grow and thrive on an integrated basis, on a basis that includes everyone. At the next level down, bilateral or interpersonal reconciliation, sort of one-on-one reconciliation. A lot of people talk here about forgiveness and the importance of forgiveness. I'm not as enthusiastic about forgiveness as a requirement of reconciliation. I think it's a very, very difficult thing to require as an element for a number of reasons, and I'll just sort of talk about this briefly. One is that perpetrators rarely ask for forgiveness. You're probably all familiar in your countries with examples of people who have come forward and sought forgiveness. They've done something terrible and they either go to the victim's family or something, and they come forward and they say, I'm sorry, I did this, I seek your forgiveness. But compared to the number of people who are actually doing wrong, the number of people who seek forgiveness is really, really small, tends to be very small for a number of reasons, psychological reasons. They tend to not come forward and ask for forgiveness. Perhaps even more problematically, I think that the requirement of forgiveness imposes a very, very big burden on victims. Some victims see it as, oh, I have to forgive you and forget, and I just have to move on. But you killed my parents, and I can't do that. I can't just forgive and forget. There's also a question about whether some of the crimes that we're talking about, in the worst cases of mass atrocity, which unfortunately are not rare, whether these crimes are in fact forgivable or not. Perhaps these are unforgivable crimes. And there are sort of religious traditions as well as secular traditions that sort of say, I can't forgive you for having killed my parent or my child or something. That's only for the victim to do, and of course the victim's not there. And in some sense, these crimes truly are crimes against humanity. It's not for any individual to forgive or to absolve or to say, it's okay, let bygones be bygones. These are, in fact, crimes against humanity that really challenge our notion of individual forgiveness. Ultimately, I think the problem with forgiveness is that it does not tend to be transformational. It doesn't actually get you from where you are in the post-conflict moment to where you need to be, where you or your community or your nation is really thriving. I think there's a lot of other ways that we can build interpersonal or bilateral reconciliation without requiring forgiveness as an element of it. And I'll just mention a couple of examples here. I heard about this one. It's actually Lema Gbawi, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize from Liberia, describes this in her book. And it's actually a situation, I think, from the Balkans, but she's just not from Liberia. She's describing a situation where in one village, part of the village after the war had no electricity. Part of the village after the war had electricity, but it didn't have any water. And the women were there living in both of these parts of the village, and what do they have to do? Well, they still have to do all the work that needs to be done, and they have to do the laundry, and they have to take care of the kids and all that kind of stuff. And the women with the water, who lived in the areas where the water is, took their laundry and big buckets of water and walked to the other part of the village or to the other village where the electricity was, and they used the washing machines to get the laundry done. So to me, that's a really wonderful example of sort of interpersonal reconciliation. It can't be legislated, right? You can't require people to do that. But you can encourage people to do that. And what happens when they're doing the laundry? Well, these people from different parts of the village who had sort of hated each other during the war, what do? Well, they start talking, and they start breaking down the barriers, and they start getting to know each other as individuals and as women who are all really dealing with the same kinds of things. And that's a really important form, I think, of interpersonal reconciliation. Another example you'll hear about later in the week is Seeds of Peace. And I was thinking about Seeds of Peace and getting the kids, youth involved in in these peace-building efforts, largely through this process of just saying, look, if you two get to know each other, you're probably not going to want to fight. You're probably going to like each other. And now what do? They go to these Seeds of Peace programs, and then my guess is they go on Facebook, and they're Facebook friends, and now they're friends for life. And they have that kind of relationship. So what governments can do here is sort of look out for opportunities to build on these places where people can come together. In the example with the village, with the electricity and the water, they can make government can not force it again, but sort of make sure that the road between the two parts of the village is passable. Make sure that people can actually get from one place to another. Even if they can't get water and electricity going, they can at least get to the point where people are, at least facilitate or facilitate people getting together and removing obstacles between them, removing the walls that might exist between them. I think it's important to understand, at least from my perspective, that reconciliation between people does not need to be a matter of deep friendship. It doesn't mean that we have to love each other. It just means we have to get along well enough to not want to hurt each other. So a matter of peaceful coexistence may be what we're aiming for when we're aiming for bilateral or interpersonal reconciliation. At the next level down, individual reconciliation, reconciliation within oneself. This is very important, obviously, and very, very difficult. Often it's very resource intensive because so many people have such strong and individualized needs. It's not the kind of thing where one law is going to fix everything. It's interesting when you talk to people or read about the trauma, the imagery of trauma, people often use the imagery of things that are broken pieces of glass. They'll describe how they felt when something happened as broken pieces of glass. One account I read of a woman seeing her child die said it was like a ceramic piece broken on the floor into 1,000,000 different pieces, and there was just no way you could put it back together. People often talk in these terms of being broken. One account I read of somebody who was tortured in a prison said how she dealt with it was that she just sort of separated her body, and part of her body she kept sort of somewhere where they couldn't get to her, even though they were getting to other parts of her body. And what she said was after the trauma ended, what she needed to do was go back to that prison and get that part of her body to make herself whole again. So there's this notion, this really explicit notion about things literally falling apart. And what reconciliation at that individual level might mean is the coming back together of those different pieces of a person. And trying to help individuals make sense of their experience. How do they reconcile as victims or as perpetrators what they did, what happened to them with the person that they see themselves as, the person that they want to be? How do we help them sort of reinvent themselves and transform themselves on this individual level? And again, this is obviously a very complicated area. To some extent, it requires therapy, and there's lots of examples where NGOs have come in to countries and or the local institutions have created opportunities to give people talking therapy as well as other kinds of therapy, art therapy, and all kinds of just different processes to help people deal with what happened to them or what they did during the war. When we talk about, as Senator Daly did after, at the end of his presentation, about suicide rates among combatants, it's extraordinary. I just read recently that in Sri Lanka more people have died of suicide than of the war. So these are really vitally important areas to consider. We don't count those numbers. We don't see that trauma, but it's obviously there. And when we'll see it is in the orphan children that those people leave behind. So it's very important to sort of provide those kinds of therapy for people. Re-education camps can also help, other kinds of things. The Clowns Sans Frontières, the Clowns Without Borders, those kinds of things can be very importantly therapeutic for people. Theater programs and all kinds of other things. And what these programs are largely meant to do, I mean, not not all of them because there's a huge range, but some of the more deeply psychological programs are really meant to help people transform themselves again so that they can go from being either victims or perpetrators, either one of those is a difficult state to be in, to being constructive, participating members of a community. So you can take sometimes the trauma that somebody endured and convert it into something that's useful. Somebody who was a soldier is strong enough to carry a gun. They're probably strong enough to help build a house. Somebody who is mourning loss of a child may have a lot of resources available to help to be a social worker. So part of it is a question of helping people sort of reinvent themselves so that they can become constructive. So those are some of the sort of topographical features, the different levels at which reconciliation happens in a society. And what I think is very important is for governments and others who are engaged in reconciliation efforts to very, very carefully identify what they're doing and at what level they're trying to operate. And I think this is one of the problems that besets reconciliation efforts most often, is that you'll have a national reconciliation program or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and people will say, oh, well, that will help victims to heal. It doesn't necessarily. Certain programs will help victims to heal. Certain programs will get the truth out. But you can't do one reconciliation program and expect it to solve other problems. So you have to very, very clearly identify what the goals are. Where are the worst traumas that you're trying to deal with in your country? And what are the programs that are specifically designed to help deal with those at that particular level? The second mapping I want to give you is sort of looking at the landmarks, looking at some of the issues that you're likely to see along this path of reconciliation as you're walking through the forest, and how do you interact with them. And I'll just mention two sort of the most significant ones right now, truth, and then I'll talk about justice. I find both, I'm not against either. Truth is great, justice is great. But I find as elements of reconciliation, they're difficult and they're problematic. And again, they have to be looked at very carefully. To begin with truth. Truth promises great things. It promises never again. The sort of, the idea that those who don't know their history are condemned to repeat it. So if we have a truth commission, we'll know our history and then we won't repeat it anymore. Well, there's plenty of examples, Rwanda being a major one, where truth commissions preceded genocide and other forms of political trauma. So I don't think it's quite enough to say, well, if we just say what the truth is, then never again will we have these difficulties. The list of wars and the list of repeated wars in the same countries sort of suggests that we need something a little bit more than that to prevent future atrocities. Another thing that truth promises is punishment. People sort of link truth and justice. If you have a truth commission, it produces a report if it names names, and depending on the relationship between the truth commission and the prosecutorial institutions in the country, you might be able to use that information from the truth commission to pursue prosecutions. And that is one useful tool, one useful way to accomplish the goal of prosecutions, if that is one of the goals. That depends on how you've set up your truth commission. In a lot of countries, you don't have that much prosecution. Maybe you have an amnesty program. Maybe you simply don't have the resources for a lot of prosecution. Truth in those cases can still help as a matter of sort of public shaming, if you will. That can be a very effective tool in reconciliation. At least you've named the names. At least people know who's who. And to the extent that there's sort of moral consensus that what was done was wrong, that public shaming can be effective. Another promise that truth makes is victim healing. But again, I think that's only true if it's supported. I think that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for instance, had as one of its goals victim healing, that if you just say the truth, if you tell us the truth, you'll feel much better. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it isn't. Depends on the individual, depends on the kind of trauma, and I think mostly it depends on the form in which you're saying the truth and how supported that is. So why doesn't truth solve all these problems? Why doesn't it deliver on these promises the way we think it might? Truth is a very complicated concept. First of all, it's not monolithic, as we know. you're familiar with the concept of victor's justice. The same thing is true of truth. You have perpetrator's truth and victim's truths, and they're often very, very different. If you look at the trial that's been going on in Cambodia, for instance, you have these defendants of the of the Khmer Rouge who don't come in saying, here's what we did, forgive us. They come in saying, we didn't kill, we didn't know, and if we did kill, it was for these reasons. They have their own truth that's really different than the truth of a lot of other people. But the fact that they have their truth has to be at least reckoned with. And these truths can often be conflicting. Personal truths can be conflicting, even within sort of an individualized conflict. Anybody who's sat with two kids in the back of a car know that people can conflict about anything and where the middle of the seat is or whatever, and those truths are real to those individuals. Historical truths are even more complicated. Who started a war? Was it a war or was it a genocide? Who were the aggressors, or were they just defending themselves? We've been hearing about the Civil War. Well, what I call the Civil War, because I'm from the North, so that's what I call it. But of course, down here, it's called something else. It's the war between the states, or the war of northern aggression, as we were told yesterday. But these words have a lot of salience. They mean a lot to the people who use them. And they reflect different kinds of truths. And it's really hard to have a conversation about a civil war if one person's calling it a genocide and one person is calling it a defensive war. Right? So those conflicting truths, again, sort of have to be reckoned with because people are very invested in their truths. It's not just an academic exercise, what should we call this thing? People really very deeply believe the truths that they have. Often after a conflict, there'll be polls or studies that are taken, and one of the questions that's often asked by the NGOs is, do you want trials, or do you want a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And overwhelmingly, people say yes, absolutely we want trials. We want justice. We want a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because we want the truth to come out. So at that level, it sounds like everybody's agreeing with each other. If you look at it more closely, what they really want often is they want their truth to come out. They want a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to vindicate what they view as the truth. They want trials not to go after the perpetrators on their side. They want trials to bring the other folks to justice. So they sound like they're agreeing on truth or justice, but they're really disagreeing on what they want and what the goals are. And they'll have very different reactions when the governments implement these programs. They'll have very different reactions to what the government produces. So any post-conflict society has to deal with the fact that it's dealing with multiple different truths, and those truths have to be taken seriously. There's narratives of oppression, of foreign aggression, of insecurity, economic instability. All these different kinds of things help to explain to one or another group what actually happened. One of the things that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission did do was recognize not so much the conflicting truths, but the different types of truth. And it actually formally recognized that there are forensic truths. There are truths that are proven by the bodies that are buried in the mass graves. There are historical truths. There are narrative truths. That is, this is what happened to me. This is what I believed. I know there's no evidence out there for it, but it is what I truly believe. So that would be sort of a narrative truth. And then the TRC developed this notion of a dialogic truth. That is, once we get all these other truths out, maybe we can talk and develop a truth or a common history to help find common ground. So what we've seen in recent years is a real, I think probably irreversible, turn toward the truth. Hardly any political trauma happens anymore without some kind of commission of inquiry, some kind of investigation, some kind of truth commission to inquire into what happened. Just in the past month alone, let me just mention a very few of the sort of major headline-getting sort of truth initiatives that we've seen. Sharif Bassiouni's report on human rights abuses in Bahrain, which may or may not lead the government to develop a commission to investigate and propose these reforms. Brazil recently announced a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate human rights abuses from 1964 to 1985. The Cambodian trial, the Khmer Rouge leaders that I just mentioned. Sri Lanka The Sri Lankan Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission submitted its report. Earlier this year, a Honduran commission investigated into the coup of a few years ago. A Kenyan commission investigated into election violence, and on and on. There is no region of the world that hasn't developed some kind of truth-based response to past atrocity. So these truth reports can be very useful depending on how they're made. One of the sort of primary uses, I think, of these is to develop some kind of a historical record. But we shouldn't confuse the historical record that these truth commissions produce with saying what the single truth is. Because no matter how careful it is, no matter how objective it seems, no matter how thorough the investigation is, there are always going to be people who say, that's simply not true, that's just their version of it. This was true in South Africa, which is sort of the most lauded of the truth commissions, but it's also true everywhere else. Nonetheless, the historical record can be very valuable. It's important just to know, just to get this information out. It can be an important educational tool for children in future generations to learn about what happened. And it can be a necessary tool for social transformation. So the question isn't whether to engage in a truth initiative or not. The question is, again, how to make the truth work for the goals of reconciliation that we're setting for ourselves. What to do with that truth and how to package it. And this requires careful design of the Truth Commission, of the Commission of Inquiry, and a careful sort of identification of the goals. What exactly do we want this commission to do, and how do we design it to make sure that it can do what it needs to do? And there's a lot of sort of detailed ways of thinking about that. The one thing I'll just mention really briefly is that truth commissions are historically tremendously underfunded, particularly in comparison to institutions of justice and retributive punishment. So one important point to keep in mind about truth commissions is that they can only do their job if they are appropriately funded, if they have the means to actually go out and talk to people and do the research that's necessary to uncover the truth, and if they have the resources that are necessary to disseminate that truth appropriately. There are also examples of truth commissions where we don't actually know how good the Truth Commission was because the report went to some government office and never saw light of day again. So it's important to sort of process through the kinds of work that we want the Truth Commission to do. Justice is another sort of landmark that you're bound to see along the path of reconciliation. Criminal justice assumes a very bright line between victims and perpetrators, between criminal acts and non-criminal acts, or between right and wrong. In a lot of cases, that's probably true. For a lot of people, it's pretty clear that what they did was wrong and unjustifiable and a criminal act under any system. But again, the reality is often much, much more complicated. So you might have a certain group of people in a society who clearly should be prosecuted. You have another huge, usually much larger group within a society where it's really hard to figure out whether they did wrong or not. Sometimes because you don't necessarily know what people did, informers, bystanders, people who sort of let things happen, people who didn't object. It's hard to figure out where to draw that line. In other cases, you know they did something horrible, but they did them under such circumstances that it's really hard to blame them. Child soldiers are sort of one large group of an example of that, where they did horrific things that had they been done by an adult, clearly you would want to prosecute them. The fact that they were done by a 10-year-old has to give us pause, and we have to try to understand what made people act and how we can not prosecute them necessarily, but help them. So in most of the situations in which you're living, situations of civil war or mass atrocity, that murky area, that sort of morally murky area, is much, much larger than the area of people who clearly did wrong and that you can punish easily, or at least cleanly, if you will. They're problematic even with respect to those people that you know did wrong and that you want to prosecute. Trials are still problematic, and again, they rarely, it seems to me, achieve their aim. And so again, you have to think very, very carefully about what's the goal of this prosecution and how do we achieve that goal. They often don't, some people think that justice, criminal justice prosecution will produce the truth. We'll finally find out what so-and-so did, and we'll be able to publicize what so-and-so did. Often they don't, again, because the rules of evidence or for whatever other reasons, the truth that they produce is one-sided, is limited to the facts, to the evidence in the case, is limited to what the person was being prosecuted for. So they don't always produce the kind of truth that we need in order to move forward. Justice is often very, very limited. It is very, very expensive, whether we're talking about local tribunals, national tribunals, or international tribunals like the ICC, the ICTY, and the ICTR. Those are hugely expensive, resource-intensive institutions. Defendants often don't get to court, or they get to court once they're very, very old after decades of waiting. They may be dismissed for reasons of competence or age. Defendants who do get to court often use the tribunals as a way of grandstanding, so you don't get sort of the clean statement of punishment that you want to get. You get people using the opportunity, using their status as defendants, particularly in high-profile cases, as opportunities to present their own side of the story, to present their own truth, and that, again, sort of complicates the issue of the murkiness of truth. Often there's a lack of evidence, so even when people do get to trial and they do get prosecuted, they get acquitted because there's lack of evidence. And finally, for those who do get sentenced, often because you're just dealing with sort of the perpetrators who did the most wrong, who really did the most evil things, or who were most responsible for loss of life and suffering, one has to ask whether the sentences that are imposed are just in any way. Do they actually provide justice? I think that's a very difficult and philosophical question that I'm not going to pretend to answer here, but I just want to pose it because I think it's a very important question to ask. Short of criminal prosecution, a number of countries have tried what's called lustration, or administrative sort of prosecution, which may not involve actual criminal trial, but may involve sort of some kind of purging, if you will, or at least the disqualification of certain people from certain types of jobs. This can be less harsh and therefore more palatable than trials. You need less evidence to sort of convict someone under this, but they get less due process. So it raises other kinds of questions about fairness. But it has been used more or less successfully in some countries. Certainly in Eastern Europe it was used. Big question about how it was used in Iraq under de-Baathification. And I think the questions that are raised by the de-Baathification do not show that it was a bad thing and shouldn't have been done, but merely really highlight the difficulty and the complexity of how you figure out, even in the context of administrative punishment, how you figure out who is liable for what, how many levels down do you go, what kind of disabilities are you imposing on them, what kind of punishments are you imposing on them. And it's just a very difficult process to figure out sort of that balance between collective and individualized guilt. In a number of countries, either as a matter of policy or sort of de facto, just because of lack of resources, you have amnesty programs. And I think actually amnesty programs can be quite useful, in part because I think in so many countries you don't have the resources to punish everybody who did wrong. And so as a matter of fact, you have amnesty. You have a system or a culture, if you will, of impunity. That's not a good thing. But what you can do with amnesty is get something in exchange for it. You can say, okay, we're not going to prosecute you, we're going to give you amnesty, but here's what you need to do to get amnesty. You need to tell us the truth about what happened, and that way we can get at the truth without a commission or without the cost of trial. You need to put down your weapons. You need to do whatever it is to earn that amnesty. So I'm sort of a fan of creative, constructive, and conditional amnesty programs whereby the government gets something in exchange for the fact that they weren't going to prosecute these people anyway because they don't have the resources. So you may as well get something for it. Some of these sort of landmarks that I've talked about are backward-looking. Some other landmarks can be forward-looking. And the forward-looking ones, just like I've suggested about amnesty, can be more transformative, can be more useful. At the nation-building level, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about transformative and forward-looking mechanisms that will, I think, sort of contribute to reconciliation. These aren't thought of as reconciliation programs, but they often do the work of reconciliation programs, sometimes even better than things that are called reconciliation commissions or reconciliation initiatives. So among the things that a nation might look at, the structure. When you're sort of reinventing the country, you have to think about issues of federalism, how much power is centralized, how much power is localized, what kinds of things are the local entities going to have control over, what kinds of things is the national entity going to have veto power over, etc. So those are really important issues that can have a lot to do with reconciliation, even though people don't think of them as reconciliation programs. Legal reforms, constitution building, and other forms of legal reforms. And I mentioned sort of property reforms, things like that can have a lot to do with whether your reconciliation programs are effective or not. Elections, I mentioned, again, some types of elections can conduce to reconciliation, not elections, but electoral systems. Some types of electoral systems can conduce to reconciliation. Some can exacerbate it. And then looking at other forms of institutions, human rights commissions that are not just transitional but actually meant to be permanent, ombudsmen and other forms of institutions within a government that can help promote reconciliation. Economic reconstruction is obviously hugely important, building an infrastructure so that people can get their lives back on track, so that markets can start up again, so that people can start interacting with each other more and more. Banking and credit systems can also conduce to reconciliation if you structure them in the right way and give people access to them in the right way. These are sort of hidden modalities of reconciliation that I think, as I said, can be very useful in promoting the true goals of reconciliation. They allow people to move forward, to get past the war, and to make their lives more constructive. So that's sort of the second map. Very, very briefly, the third map I just want to mention in terms of time and direction, and I just want to sort of briefly touch on these issues. Obviously, as I've sort of mentioned, some of the things that we do are backward-looking, some of the things that we do are forward-looking, and it's important, again, just to understand the difference. When you're developing a truth commission, you have to understand the transformative limitations of that. It may be valuable, but it has limited transformational potentials. So you want to choose the forms of reconciliation that are what the people need and what is going to help people in the new order. In terms of time, well, we're in Savannah, and we're still talking about the Civil War that was over 150 years ago, so I guess we can say that this takes time. Senator Daly said 40 to 60 years, and then in answer to a question, he sort of upped it and said, actually, we need to be thinking in terms of centuries. Yeah, these things take a lot of time. Sequencing can be very important. There are things that are useful at one point that are not useful later on. Some people, you had mentioned building walls. There may be times when building a wall is very useful just to stop the violence, and other times when you need to take those walls down and encourage people to come together. The sort of the subtitle or the title of this conference as Resilience suggests that these are long-term processes. Let me just close by mentioning a few very brief sort of words of advice, I guess, as we think about sort of finding our way, finding our path through to reconciliation. The first is define your terms. Reconciliation can mean too many different things, and you're bound to upset people if you promise them reconciliation and you're thinking justice, and they want reconciliation and they're thinking truth. You're bound to disappoint the public. And it's important to, I mean, you're doing this to sort of get their participation in this program. So it's really important, I think, to define your terms and to be intentional about what you're trying to accomplish. What are these things that you're trying to accomplish, and how do you build the institutions to accomplish those specific goals? You can't accomplish everything. You can't get reconciliation from one thing at all these different levels. So you have to be real clear about what the goals are. The role of women, again, mentioned by Senator Daly, I think that's hugely important. Women are most likely to be harmed by the trauma. They're most likely to be still suffering in the aftermath of the war. And they may or may not be, if we want to generalize about it, but they may or may not be the most likely to forgive, to be able to have the resilience to move on. In any event, they do have important informal roles in communities in particular to help people to move on. So I think that the role of women has been underappreciated and needs to be focused on more. Know your palette. Understand the huge range of reconciliation options, the many, many, many different ways that you can promote reconciliation. This is a very creative process. Reconstruction is a really creative endeavor. So take advantage of that. Use all the tools at your that are at your disposal to promote reconciliation in all these different ways. And finally, be patient, because this does take a lot of time. This wasn't meant to sort of tell each country how to proceed, because obviously each country is unique. And what I'd like to do now is just open it up for questions, or if you have experiences in your own countries that you'd like to share, be happy to sort of talk about those. Thank you.